It's the crown jewel of Ontario, there's no question about that. It's one of the most unique wilderness parks in all of Canada.
4.5 hours north of Toronto, nestled on Georgian Bay, lies Killarney Provincial Park, a land of quartzite rocks, turquoise lakes, and magnificent forests. This land inspired Canada's famed Group of Seven.
Some people would consider A.Y. Jackson the grandfather of Killarney Park.
It is just as inspiring for scientists.
It may not be an exaggeration to say that the word environment became a public phrase based on work in places like Killarney.
But where some see beauty, others see resources. The park has attracted the interest of logging companies, and it has been poisoned from the sky.
Sudbury was just a rolling fumes of sulfuric acid that just rolled along the landscape and devastated plants and animals.
The fight against these forces led to the creation and expansion of the park, a fight that still continues today.
We're going to hold it in the condition of undeveloped nature, and they will see the landscape as people did at the turn of the century and before.
It's absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. There's been people coming to the Killarney district for, hundreds of thousands of years.
Located 4.5 hours north of metropolitan Toronto, the boundaries of Killarney Provincial Park protect nearly 500 square kilometers of wilderness on the northern coast of Georgian Bay. The La Cloche Mountains are an enticing playground for hikers and canoeists. The rugged coast invites adventure. And for some European settlers, it felt like home.
Killarney as a name was brought into this area from people who were from Europe. And it just reminded them of the hills of Killarney in Ireland. Its original name is an Aboriginal name, Shippananning, and Shippananning means it's a safe canoe passage. It's a landscape park. That's how I like to refer to it. It's not like you come and you arrive and there's a destination at one point. You have to come back here many times because the park has many different complexions. Behind us, where we are right now, it's got Georgian Bay and the big waters of that Great Lake. And then inland, there are these connected waterways and small lakes of different sizes that are very, very different, each one of them.
Killarney Provincial Park appeals to more than just nature lovers. The rich natural resources attracted both industrialists and artists. In fact, this park's existence was inspired by art. A.Y. Jackson was a founding painter in Canada's famed Group of Seven. Once introduced to the Killarney district, Jackson returned to its scenic mountain ranges to paint year after year.
Jackson used to come in on the train through Willisville in the northwest corner of the park, and they'd hike up into a place called Grace Lake and Nally Lake.
In 1931, when A.Y. Jackson learned that the wilderness he loved was scheduled to be logged, he wrote an urgent letter of protest to the government. In 1933, a small forest preserve in the Killarney district was established by the Ontario government.
Some people would consider A.Y. Jackson the grandfather of Killarney Park because his original work in this area and because of the scenic quality of the landscape, he didn't want to see it logged.
In 1964, further lobbied by members of the Group of Seven, the protected reserve was expanded and Killarney Provincial Park was established. Today, visitors to Killarney are able to see the La Cloche Mountains just as A.Y. Jackson saw them. Jim and Sue Waddington are on a continuing quest to find locations in Killarney that inspired the Group of Seven.
We've always been interested in the Group 7, but in 1976, I was doing a tapestry and rug cooking, and I chose to do Valley Lake by A.Y. Jackson, and we went and looked at the painting at the gallery, and then we thought, oh, I wonder if that lake at the west end of the park, Valley Lake, is the same Valley Lake. We carried a small picture of the painting from a book that we had. As we got to the top of the hill, we found the exact location where Jackson had sat when he painted that.
After we found one of the places that the Group of Seven had painted, we thought that that was a nice way to see Canada. We thought we'd just go and visit a bunch of other places, but it turned out that nobody knew where these places were. So we decided to try to find out on our own.
The Waddingtons have found 160 locations over the last 30 years.
As far as we've been able to determine, this was the spot which has the highest concentration of works done by the Group of Seven anywhere in Canada. Each painting is a puzzle you have to solve. You have to look at maps and try to decide where the place might be. And if you are lucky and there's some hills in the painting, you can try to then identify that with a topographical map. There's a famous photograph of Franklin Carmichael sitting high up above a lake sketching. We like to take people to show them that place, and before long they'll come and sit down on the rock in just the same strange way that Franklin Carmichael sat on it.
One particular island on the lake interests them this afternoon. On its far end, an old withered pine clings to the shore.
The bent pine is one of my favorites. It's a painting done on a day like today. It's not one done on a pretty sunny day.
Jackson said he didn't like to paint in the summer because then his paintings were too pretty.
And the clouds are low, and anyone who has been out camping knows about those kinds of days, and I think that's why it appeals to me.
Hats off to the Waddingtons. You know, I can attest to all of their research that it's just phenomenal what they're accomplishing. And I think that we'll be able to rewrite Canadian art history.
The art in Killarney is not just for the history books. The park, inspired by art, continues to inspire artists today. Pierre Sabarin's studio overlooks Killarney.
I paint in every type of weather condition imaginable because it's, you get colors and feelings and expressions when you work in different inclement weathers. And Killarney affords a lot of that.
Danielle Gardner's studio is the park. She starts and finishes her paintings in the wild. It's a style known as en plein air.
En plein air artists are basically, historically, the earliest environmentalists because they are protecting what they see. And they are showing the viewer what they're feeling at that moment in time and how the weather and the light revealing the rocks, the trees, the water ends up being reflected in the picture.
The protection of Killarney Park is connected to a rich history of Canadian landscape painting. But the picturesque La Cloche Mountains and the crystal clear lakes amidst them were being exposed to a hidden danger.
In the 60s or 70s, we realized we'd lost about 100 lake trout populations in the region.
An unseen killer was attacking the park from above. The La Cloche Mountains are a signature feature of Killarney Provincial Park. They are as geologically unique as they are beautiful.
The La Cloche Mountains are a sandstone, a white sandstone that's been welded together by the pressure of the sea plates. And what it ends up being is a quartz crystal. Those lakes are the same materials that the finest glass is made of, and that's had a lot to do with the chemistry of these lakes. The lakes are really atmospheric goblets.
Those goblets created crystal clear lakes, since so little material other than rainwater enters them.
We're looking at some of the clearest lakes in the world.
You can think of these lakes as like little glass collection vessels.
The very nature of the lakes made them vulnerable to a silent killer, one that appeared in the mid-1960s, shortly after the establishment of the park.
It was a slow, steady deterioration. The local people in Killarney would come here for recreation and fishing, and they didn't really sound the alarm bell that for some reason fishing started to decline. We didn't see dead fish rolling on the beaches, but all of a sudden, in the early 70s, it became obvious that we were losing populations all over the place here.
When scientists set out to find out why fish populations were declining in the lakes, they made a monumental discovery.
It was a rich mining time, and they were using very, very crude technology to process the ore. Sudbury was just rolling fumes of sulfuric acid that just rolled along the landscape and devastated plants and animals. And it lasted for decades and decades as the largest source of sulfur in the world. Sulfuric rain just pouring down on the rocks and soils and changing the pH of lakes to the point that sensitive fish and vertebrates and insects couldn't live anymore.
The discovery of that there was a link between sulfur dioxide in air quality and damage to lake trout populations was quite a significant find, because people didn't have at that time, they didn't understand that that was a relationship.
There's a good spot up here.
In 1972, the University of Toronto published the findings of atmospheric scientists working in Killarney.
There we are, lake trout. Where are you?
Their conclusions drew attention to an environmental threat they called acid rain. The discovery became headline news.
People were revved up because this was their holiday place. And if at a place where you want to be away from it all, the atmospheric contaminants are following you to your holiday spot and polluting the lake, and you can no longer fish, and loons cannot reproduce. People were mad about it.
Under pressure from an enraged public, the Ontario government put a fix in place. The Ministry of the Environment instructed industry to cut emissions of sulfur by more than half.
People really forced political and industrial change. In those days, the public were intolerant of losing their natural resources, and they made their industries and they made their politicians take notice. When the public realized that if a wilderness area like Killarney can show the effects of long-range atmospheric pollutants from the Ohio Valley or from north of here from Sudbury, then all North America is living under the same atmosphere. And it may not be an exaggeration to say that the word environment became a public phrase based on work in places like Killarney.
After curbing emissions, the next step was to try to reestablish fish populations.
We started in this park with about 7 or 8 lakes where we tried to bring the lake trout back with a stocking of different age classes. And we kept that up for 15, 20 years without too much sign of success.
It took 30 years before fish stocks began to show improvement. Now, discovering a reproducing lake trout is a happy find, but not a surprise.
Big spawning female.
It was 2009 that we saw the first young lake trout in many decades produced in George Lake. And students were here, and it was a very exciting night.
Good luck with you.
But the fight to regenerate Killarney's lakes isn't over.
It's remarkable how the clarity of the lakes change. It gets a little less clear as the lakes recover. And so when we use the Secchi Des, it's a simple tool. It's hundreds of years old that helps you decide how far down in the water you can actually see this thing. But George Lake used to be able to see it about 15 meters, and now it's around 7. Some people might think that's a loss, but all it means is there's more life in the water than there used to be. A third of the lakes that were badly damaged in Killarney are still badly damaged. The hilltop lakes still don't have fish in them. They're still too acidic. So we've made it to the first generation where the valley lakes with sufficient soil can recover, but the pure white hilltop lakes are still not there.
Scientists like John Gunn believe another 70 to 80% reduction in sulfur emissions may still be necessary before many of Killarney's ultra-clear lakes can recover.
Oh, there's little fish in there.
Still, the work of Canadian atmospheric scientists in Killarney is considered a resounding success.
And it's very much a center of hope for the world, as if, you know, you see it today as a simple, beautiful park, but chemists see it as a magnificent recovery story. The water is so different than it was that this park has had a big role in protecting the world's atmosphere.
Killarney's place in environmental history adds to its legacy as one of Canada's most storied wilderness parks. A big part of that story is protecting one of the most threatened animals in the wild.
If eastern wolves are here in Killarney, then that's exciting because it's one of the few places in the world where there would be a pack of eastern wolves.
Killarney Provincial Park is a wilderness park. That's not just a nice name. It's an official designation. It means the park is large enough to allow nature to run its course with little impact by humans. Because of this, Killarney provides a refuge to hundreds of species. Biologist Linda Rutledge is trying to track down one of the most rare and mysterious mammals in the park, the eastern wolf.
Wolves are really elusive creatures. They don't like to be around humans, and so when people are in the parks, they see all kinds of other wildlife, but rarely do they see a wolf. And so they're difficult to study for that reason.
Linda is using DNA analysis to determine if eastern wolves are frequenting the park.
In this project in Killarney, we're using a non-invasive approach, which we go through the woods and collect scat samples. Oh, and that looks fresh, eh? And when we get that kind of sample for genetic analysis, it's as good as having a blood sample directly from the animal. So this is probably... When I take it back to the lab, we then extract the DNA from it and use genetic markers in order to identify it as to what kind of canis species it is.
Under the microscope, you can actually really distinguish the hair between deer or moose or elk, or even if it's, beaver or muskrat or any of the smaller mammals they might be eating.
Through her research, Linda has found proof that a pack of eastern wolves is thriving inside the park. An important discovery because eastern wolves are endangered.
Right now, the eastern wolf is considered a species of special concern under the Endangered Species Act. Eastern wolves are not protected except within the provincial and national parks. So they serve almost as refuges for wolves. If eastern wolves are here in Killarney, then that's exciting because it's one of the few places in the world where there would be a pack of eastern wolves.
From the work of scientists like Linda Rutledge and John Gunn, provincial planners have learned that parks provide key protection to wildlife, and that they offer a laboratory to study the subtle but significant changes in our ecosystems.
It's important to have these baseline areas that are going to be there for a long time, where nature is the dominant force of change, and we can see natural populations, how they change over time.
Parks are perfect places for long-term monitoring research that, because they're not, as I say, confounded with a lot of other signals. Many of the signals that we were looking for in the atmosphere are very subtle ones, very small changes that you would look for, whether in the water or the sediments of the lake. And you can't find them if you've got a housing development and a factory and a road through this area.
As far as most environmental scientists are concerned, the more land that is protected from development, the better. The park's boundaries have already expanded twice to protect nearly 50,000 hectares of land. Park planner Will Kershaw has guided the expansions. But Kershaw still has bigger dreams.
Is the park boundary set and final? No. The guidelines that we have is you're supposed to represent the landforms of an area and use watersheds as your basis for determining boundaries. So when we looked at the boundary that was there, it didn't capture all of the different ridges that are in this area, the La Cloche Range. It's a spectacular scenery. And imagine, the extensive Georgian Bay waters and, the many islands that are out there. And we wanted to see the entire eastern terminus of the La Cloche Range included in the Wilderness Park.
It's a calling Kershaw embraces.
This isn't just a job for me. Like, I'm one of the luckiest people in the world. I'm doing exactly what I want to do. Working with people who are looking for areas that are managed for, let's say, nature first, where we have ecological integrity within the landscape is one of our main interests.
Park Superintendent Chuck Miller hopes that other landscapes in the province will receive the protection that Killarney was given so long ago.
Parks are important to both the country and the people, local people that live near them and like to visit them. We need wild places that are biological reserves, where ecosystems are still intact, and people still need to have contact with nature. It's part of our Canadian heritage. The way we think of ourselves as Canadians is tied to the landscape. The land is who we are.
This is Nanabojo, the sleeping giant. To geologists and cartographers, he is a geographic abnormality. A peninsula that looks like a man in repose. To the First Nations, he is legendary protector.
Nanabojo was the spirit of the deep waters.
To the residents across the water, he is a constant companion.
Sleeping Giant is an iconic image to the people of Thunder Bay.
To the people who visit Sleeping Giant Provincial Park, he is a place of spectacular beauty.
It's something that's hard to put into words. It's more of like a feeling that you get when you're out here. It's very hard to describe.
He is also a stage upon which life and death is played out every day.
There's really no simple answers when it comes to trying to understand the ecology of the park.
Moose are disappearing. The white-tailed deer population is exploding. The sleeping giant is a mystery, and park managers are trying to find answers. The view across the harbor is as familiar to the residents of Thunder Bay as the sunrise. From the air, Sleeping Giant Provincial Park Superintendent Greg Wilson surveys the landscape.
Right now we're at the northwestern boundary of the park. We're heading towards the Lookout Cliffs. It is an excellent example of some of the steepest cliffs in Ontario. There's an approximately 100-meter or 300 feet drop down to the Lake Superior shoreline below.
The park is located on the Sibley Peninsula, a 50-kilometer stretch of land projecting out from the northern shores of Lake Superior. Just a 1-hour drive from the city of Thunder Bay, this small area contains spectacular wilderness opportunities.
Sleeping Giant offers some of the most accessible and breathtaking views of Lake Superior, and also some of the most unique wildlife experiences with the deer population, the wolf population, as well as over 200 species of birds.
But the main draw to the park is a massive mesa rock formation visible from hundreds of kilometers away. Its unique profile has made it more than mere landscape. This landmark is so striking, it is featured on the flag of Thunder Bay and was voted one of the 7 wonders of Canada.
Sleeping Giant is an iconic image to the people of Thunder Bay. As a resident of Thunder Bay, every morning or every time that you're down at the waterfront, you can see the giant, and it's a very prominent feature on the landscape. People seem to take the giant to heart.
The Sleeping Giant is sacred to the Anishinaabe people, the Ojibwe people. Various legends of the Sleeping Giant have been told. One of the most common ones is that Nanabojo was the spirit of the deep waters. He bestowed upon the Ojibwe people, Anishinaabe people, a rich vein of silver. And he told people that they could use the silver for making ornaments and tools, and they could trade with it, but that they could never reveal the site of this secret vein of silver. And if they did, then he would disappear. He would leave them. And so it's said that 2 white men were led to this site by a Sioux brave. And as a result, Nanabojo was turned to stone. And now he lies out here in Thunder Bay.
The rich vein of silver said to be protected by the Sleeping Giant is not just a myth. In the late 19th century, the second richest known deposit of silver in the world was discovered just off the Sibley Peninsula. Miners flocked to the area to reap its riches, and the town of Silver Islet was born.
And so in 1870, the Silver Islet mine was created on a small rock about a mile or 2 offshore, just a few miles from the Sleeping Giant. That mine was very productive, and a large quantity of silver was mined over about 10 years. But by about 1878, the high-grade silver was pretty well mined out. And also the price of silver was plunging. And the last straw came in the fall of 1883, a ship which would bring a shipment of coal to run the pumps failed to make it to deliver the coal. And so by the winter of 1884, the pumps failed and the mine shafts filled with water, never to be reopened.
The abandoned mine shafts of Silver Islet have since been reclaimed by the waters of Lake Superior. But the old mining town remains nestled beneath the cliffs of the Sleeping Giant. In 1944, Sleeping Giant Provincial Park was formed, its boundaries established to protect the Sibley Peninsula from any further mining, forestry, or resource extraction. Today, Nanabojo, the Sleeping Giant, has been restored to his original purpose as described by legend: protector, healer, and teacher.
In order for us to be whole human beings, for us to be healthy, for us to have an appreciation for wilderness and for the ecosystem that supports us all, it's important for people to be able to get to truly wild places and to really enjoy the scenery, to be able to explore the ecology, and to renew themselves.
Sleeping Giant offers visitors 244 square kilometers of wilderness. Enjoying the park while protecting its ecosystems is a balancing act for both visitors and park staff. Students from the Outdoor Recreation Program at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay have started their day with a clear goal: to reach the top of the Sleeping Giant by sunrise. The autumn air is cold and wet. The climb to the top of the Giant through the dark is strenuous, but the payoff is huge.
Sweet.
Yeah. And that's what we were saying, yeah, as precise as possible, so
The students are being trained for careers in outdoor recreation. Instructor Tim Wheeler has led the group to the summit of the Giant.
We have an outdoor industry in Canada where people make their living helping people enjoy what we're fortunate enough to have around us. One of you could stay on this side, right? And the Sleeping Giant Provincial Park is a fantastic classroom. We have lots of elevation, lots of features, lots of different types of trail systems. Being able to help facilitate these students' experiences as part of this program is incredibly rewarding.
Sort of support and slowly get a nice arc of water.
Once people can keep themselves comfortable in the outdoors in varied conditions, it adds confidence to the person and a little bit of ownership over your own self.
I could lie here and look at this cliff forever. Like, I just love it.
Sleeping Giant's close proximity to the city of Thunder Bay means that the park is a hub of activity year-round. During the spring, summer, and fall, visitors hike and camp.
The park itself contains 100 kilometers of hiking trails with 40 remote campsites in the backcountry. We do have the largest trail system in Ontario parks.
Come winter, Sleeping Giant is a hotspot for Nordic skiers.
Operations really gear up again in the winter with our ski trails.
Sleeping Giant attracts 55,000 visitors per year. Accommodating them while protecting the habitat of the diverse wildlife species that exist here is difficult.
For me, one of the biggest challenges of being a park manager is maintaining a balance between the ecological integrity of the natural environment and the development of the park for recreation and tourism.
Peter Crooks is the manager of Thunder Bay Nordic Trails. He knows firsthand the delicate relationship between tourism and ecological health. Crooks and his team work closely with park staff to maintain nearly 50 kilometers of cross-country ski trails in preparation for the Sleeping Giant Loppet. The Sleeping Giant Loppet is the premier mass participation cross-country ski race in North America. Held every March, it draws nearly 1,000 competitors.
People come from the Midwest United States, from Western Canada, from Alaska, from Eastern Canada, from Quebec, from all over North America, basically, to compete in this event. It is quite a prestigious thing to do now.
Preparing the ski trails is a massive undertaking, requiring year-round effort.
We have 2 snowcats in our operation. We have between a dozen and 15 large snowmobiles, multitudes of grooming equipment, summer equipment as well. We try during the summertime to keep up with cutting trees off that have fallen down. When we get to the fall time, like now, basically we do final mowing, which is tall grass in some places, and twigs, etc.
Grooming the trails to world-class standards does not mean Crooks has carte blanche when it comes to how the environment is affected.
We are under some restrictions because it is a provincial park and some of the areas are designated wilderness and nature preserves. We try and keep the trails out in Sleeping Giant Park as intimate as possible with the trees close to the trail. We don't cut the evergreen trees away from the sides.
With the first snowfall only a few weeks away, Crooks and his team struggle to make last-minute adjustments to the trails.
We've got a few trees down on Burma and grass that's probably 3 feet high in a few places, so we've got to get ready for the snow coming.
When snow descends on the north shores of Lake Superior, Sleeping Giant is transformed into a Nordic skier's paradise. But even with the best intentions, it is impossible to avoid impacting the ecosystem.
We do sometimes have to sacrifice certain elements of the natural environment to develop the park and make it more user-friendly and to promote tourism. Even though we encourage people to leave a small footprint as possible, when you have a large number of users in a fairly small area, you're going to have signs of, trampled environment, different footprints and things like that.
Steve Kingston is a zone ecologist at Sleeping Giant. He's particularly interested in the dramatic population changes of wildlife here.
It is. It's a really good view down the pass.
In the 70s and 80s, moose were very abundant in the park, and people would suggest that you come into Sleeping Giant Park and you're almost guaranteed to see a moose. Now the moose numbers are much lower. They're still here, moose, but they're much lower numbers, and deer have actually increased quite a bit. Why are moose numbers going down in areas and deer number going up?
It's possible the culprit is the trail system the park has worked so hard to maintain. Park ecologists at Sleeping Giant Provincial Park have a mystery on their hands. Dramatic changes are happening to the wildlife population here. Moose populations are declining, but numbers of deer have exploded. There are so many deer at Sleeping Giant that they are damaging vegetation, causing highway accidents and spreading disease. Ecologists wonder whether the park's trail system is playing a role in population fluctuations. To learn more, heat and motion-sensitive cameras are strategically placed along the trails.
So these cameras are set up as part of a research project to better understand how wolves, deer, moose, and other critters are using these trail systems that we have set up. And these camera traps are very useful because basically they can be your eyes in the forest for you when you're not here all the time.
An archive of images is building, allowing ecologists to determine how the trails alter life in the woods.
One of the complicated questions to answer is, what is that interaction between moose and deer? Why are moose numbers going down in areas and deer number going up?
Data collected from the trap cameras indicates that deer are frequently using cleared ski trails, especially in times of deep snow, to outrun and outwit predators.
You can imagine as the snow starts to get deeper and deeper and deeper, there could be significant advantages to animals using trails that have been groomed by a groomer. Much easier to walk on, much easier to travel along. And the other hypothesis is that the actual activity of humans is actually helping to keep some of the predators like wolves away. And so deer can actually use these areas as predator refuges and take advantage of that situation.
Ecologists suspect that this, along with problems moose face in the summer months, is altering the population balance between deer and moose.
Actually, in the summertime, there's heat stress for moose. So if summers are getting warmer, then that's actually very stressful for the moose populations. Another suggestion is that there's a brainworm that are carried by deer that moose get, and these brainworm won't damage or really interfere with the deer very much, where if moose get this brainworm, it can have serious consequences for it.
More research needs to be done before ecologists have results.
There's really no simple answers when it comes to trying to understand the ecology of the park, of the province, of the boreal forest. It's very complicated. But our little piece is trying to collect the information to help us get a firmer understanding of what's actually happening across our landscapes. One of the other great values of protected areas that is sometimes underappreciated is the fact that we can do collection efforts in the park, but if those same collection efforts are done outside the park, then we can understand what the influence the management practices are having outside the park, such as forestry and mining. So parks can sort of act as these controls or benchmarks for this greater landscape experiment that's happening.
Another project conducted by Kingston and his team involves using song meters to study the more than 200 species of birds that call Sleeping Giant home.
So one of the reasons we chose this spot particularly is because it's near this wetland and it's also near a forest. And what these monitoring devices do is they allow us to get the sound recordings of the singing birds as well as the singing amphibians during the breeding season. And all this information ultimately goes into a database so that we can look at that information and compare it to other sites within the park and indeed sites outside the park as well. The boreal forest is fairly important for a lot of the birds that migrate to Central, Southern America. They come up here in the breeding season, and so the boreal forest provides this ample opportunity for them to have lots of resources and to raise their young. When the winter comes, there's not very many species of birds that stay here in the park throughout the winter. There's approximately 14 or so, like the gray jays, blue jays, lots of different woodpeckers that are able to stay here throughout the cold winter months as well.
But when it comes to understanding bird activity in Sleeping Giant, Kingston gets most of his help from bird expert John Woodcock and the Thunder Cape Bird Observatory, which sits at the end of the Sibley Peninsula, an ideal spot for keeping track of migrating birds.
This is a peninsula that points south into Lake Superior, and many of the birds that we are interested in are land birds, and they would prefer to migrate over land. So when they reach the north shore of Lake Superior, they will mill about and look for a piece of land that points in a generally southerly direction, and this happens to be such a peninsula. So their numbers are focused, they're concentrated at this point.
Woodcock and his team document the numbers of birds migrating through Sleeping Giant.
We're drawing from a large area. So we're taking a sample of birds from northern Ontario, northern Quebec, northern Manitoba.
The observatory is a maze of nets and traps.
Here's the first of our mist nets. It's a very fine mesh. Yes, that's what they call them, mist nets. So when birds are flying about doing their daily business, they don't see these nets, and they will fall into the net, just like this little bag that I just threw in there. We open mist nets for 7 hours each day, and we're capturing birds in nets. We have other traps, heligoland traps and ground traps, in which we also capture birds.
During peak periods, researchers band up to 500 birds a day. By late autumn, most birds have migrated through the peninsula, but woodcock is on hand to document the latecomers.
We capture them for the purpose of banding them, determining their age and sex, and they're all released unharmed.
The Thunder Cape Bird Observatory is an important station for birding research across North America.
We've had Tennessee warblers that we've banded here that have been recovered in Panama, and sharp-shinned hawks that get recovered in Mexico. And hundreds of other species get recovered all over the United States. And we do find out a lot about bird movements through these recoveries.
The role of Sleeping Giant as a refuge for the birds cannot be overstated.
The park's role is very important to us because the entire peninsula, some 90 square miles, is protected. So it's natural habitat for all these birds that are moving through this area.
Being able to use the lakes and forests of Sleeping Giant as a sanctuary for birds, fish, and wildlife is an opportunity park staff treasure.
Every day I come into work motivated to make a difference and to do everything that I can to protect and preserve this beautiful natural environment.
Well, I think when people come and to the campground or go for hikes in Sleeping Giant Park, they really come away with integration with nature. The fact that they're part of nature and they can look at all these beautiful sights and sounds and understand that they're part of the ecology of the world. And they're not independent from nature. They're a part of it.
There's a lot of development going on, not only within northwestern Ontario right now, but within the entire country. And it's important to look at these significant pockets of land, such as Ontario parks, and maintain them for future generations.